Hello, friends, and welcome to the June 24th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Atnip, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and today we continue our summer fun with a third installment of our four-part series on public education. It is summer vacation for many, but we have homework for you to support Texas public schools. As I said last week, the goal is to prepare you to meet with your elected representatives and candidates for office, so make sure to take notes. Joining us today will be one of the state's leading advocates for public schools, Reverend Charles Johnson, Executive Director of Pastors for Texas Children, who is never afraid to mix it up with elected officials. He'll be followed by Josh Houston, who will talk about a recent Supreme Court decision and how it might impact the Texas public education system, and he'll share some thoughts on what we can do about it. And to kick us off, the Weekly Word today will feature a Texas Impact board member, Reverend Erin Walter, Executive Director of the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry. And just a side note, go ahead and prepare to have some lyrics stuck in your head for the rest of the day. But before we start, a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, let me note that we're rotating summer vacations this year among the staff and recorded the two conversations today over the course of the last few weeks, so there might be some things that are slightly dated. Reverend Johnson recorded June 13th and Josh recorded June 23rd. As for today, y'all, I just don't know where to start. I've been watching the January 6 hearings over the course of the last few weeks. I'm still upset and frustrated about the Uvalde shootings, and we've seen a slew of Supreme Court decisions that will cause harm, with more on the way. Y'all, it's pretty rough out there. And I do this for a living, but even I can sometimes feel like I just want to turn it all off and pull the covers up over my head and hide. But we can't, or it'll just keep getting worse. Taking mental breaks is good and even necessary. But friends, I say this every week, and it's not just a cliche. It's not just a thing that we say. But I really believe that the world needs Texans of faith and people of good conscience, active and engaged, organizing and mobilizing in ways that we never have. We know that the other side is loud and active, and we have to respond. Vulnerable people are being attacked, and our faith calls us to respond. We have to get organized, we have to put in the effort, and we have to do everything we can to respond effectively. And over the coming months, we'll give you some opportunities to organize, to meet with other like-minded advocates in your area, so stay tuned for ways that you can get involved. But for today, let's start by finding a few friends to talk to. Start to build a community or a group of people in your network that will commit to doing the work necessary to protect Texas kids, Texas families, and all of our communities from those who are trying to do harm. And make sure now that they're committed to talking to their candidates and representatives, that they commit to volunteering for those who share our values, and that we all plan to vote in November. As hard as this gets, I find hope in this community, in the Weekly Witness listeners, the Texas Impact Rapid Response Team, legislative engagement groups, and our faithful members. And my hope will continue to increase as the numbers of Texans of faith participating grows. So stay tuned, because we have work to do and we'll have opportunities for you to get involved. For today, back to public education, where we will have a real challenge to the public school system this election season and in the next legislature. So we hope this series will give you the information you need to understand the issues around public ed and have conversations with your representatives to protect public schools. And with that, here we go. Our weekly word with Reverend Erin Walter.
Freedom ain't free. Oh, freedom ain't free. If you want freedom for children, fight for public schools. Freedom ain't free. Hi, friends. I'm the Reverend Erin Walter, and I serve as the minister and executive director of the Texas Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry. I can scarcely sing that one verse without choking up. I've recently returned from the Poor People's Campaign Moral March in Washington, D.C., where poor and low-wage people talked about the heartbreaking challenges of trying to survive and raise families in the United States. I left D.C. with that song, Freedom Ain't Free, on my heart. It's a Nico Whitfield song included in the We Rise songbook of the Poor People's Campaign, which I wholeheartedly recommend to you. And it tells us if we want freedom for children, we have to fight for public schools. This feels so true, especially in this time of shifting, ongoing pandemic. When COVID-19 began, my kids were in 1st and 4th grades at the public neighborhood elementary school where my siblings and I also went to school when we were kids. I believe in roots, in community. And as a Unitarian Universalist, I believe that every person has inherent worth and dignity, not earned worth, inherent worth. And I believe that all life is connected, that liberation is collective. That means I am called to fight for public education. As a minister, it would be spiritual malpractice for me to give up on public education because it is hard, because it has been eroded by those who prioritize conservative religious values over equitable opportunity for all. We cannot shrug and leave schooling to those with money or the temperament for homeschooling. That did not work for me very well in the pandemic. We must show up loudly at school board meetings rather than succumb to despair over diluted sex education and revisionist racist history curriculum. Freedom ain't free, and neither is public education. We must fight for it. I will tell you, with her permission, that my daughter came out as gay during our virtual school year of the pandemic. Her celebratory coming out was one of the most joyful highlights of an excruciating, isolated year and a half from March 2020 to August 2021, when she finally returned in person to her beloved public middle school. What got us through in that time of isolation, among other things, was the Gay Straight Alliance from her school. The GSA met online every week. My daughter made friends. They played games. I could hear laughter upstairs. It was everything. I thank God, the universe, and Lively Middle School every day for that public school GSA. As a Unitarian Universalist, one of our sacred sources is lived experience. So I don't just trust my own. As a community minister, I like to turn to my wider community for their input, their stories on important issues. I asked on Facebook recently, why does public education matter to you? My beloved said, because only true public education fully supports special education. Because as soon as you take the public out of education, many people will lose all access to education. They said, it's our best chance at equity and equality. And I know, my friend Phil said, it's a reason my parents immigrated. They said, it's essential for democracy, and our ability to effectively govern ourselves is paramount. All else fails if we cannot do that. And a fellow UU minister in the South said, I was raised in an openly racist family. Going to public school put me in close proximity with people of many racial backgrounds, an important step in helping me break the intergenerational curse of racism. I also heard from people about the heartbreaking challenges and unsafe situations students and teachers are facing in schools today, the harm being caused. One friend said she is concerned there is no education in the education system, like there is no justice in the legal system. Friends, all the more reason for us as people of faith to answer our call now to fight for public education. We must show up and make the changes our kids and educators, our whole society need. To give up on public education would be to give up on everything we hold dear. So I offer this prayer to you, and I say it for myself, my kids, for our teachers, for all of us. Spirit of life and love, give us more strength than that. Nourish our hearts, minds, and spirits with the determination to build the world we dream about. A world where public education gives life, inspires creativity, solves problems, and helps bring about a just and equitable society for our children and the generations to come. May it be so. May we be the ones to see to it. Amen.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's conversation is friend of the program, Reverend Charles Johnson, Executive Director of Pastor for Texas Children. Reverend Johnson, thanks so much for the time today.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure to be with Texas Impact. I have respected and loved your organization for a long time. Appreciate the mission that y'all have. I don't know how you do it. You cover so many great justice issues. B. Moorhead and your whole team. We see you in the Capitol. We see you in the communities throughout Texas, and we're proud to be a partner with you.
Well, and we certainly appreciate you and Pastors for Texas Children. We've definitely seen you in the Capitol, but more seen you in the news and on Twitter over the course of the last few weeks, and we're going to jump into some of that. But before we get to the important public policy topics we have to cover today, I feel like we have to start once again this week with a word about Uvalde. I know Josh said a couple of weeks ago that people tend to get really angry for a few days about topics like these school shootings, then forget about it as time goes on. Charlie, I haven't forgotten yet. I don't know if you have, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that tragic shooting.
Well, Scott, thank you for your spiritual sensitivity and mentioning that first. We definitely, at Pastors for Texas Children, we believe prayer is powerful, but only if it leads us to action, right? Not just thoughts and prayers, including thoughts and prayers, but also the positive action for justice and for fairness. And of course, we've got a long way to go. We've got some good news out of Washington. It looks like we do have a bipartisan consensus on at least some small steps. Hopefully that will be the beginning of a process that gets us some greater measures to protect our children. Josh is right. We've got short attention spans. By the way, Josh Houston's a good friend, and we see Josh in the Capitol all the time also. And so, it's our job to stay noisy about this, isn't it? It's our job to advocate on behalf of our children. Texas Impact does that. PTC does that. Obviously, gun safety is not specifically our issue. It's public education, but now it relates to public schools, doesn't it, Scott?
Absolutely.
And now it suddenly has become the paramount issue in the safety and protection of our children. We don't want to make our schools armed camps. We don't want to make public school teachers, into military professionals, soldiers, gun carrying persons. They're there to teach our children, shape our children. So I think we just keep it hot for our elected officials. I've been on the phone this morning with a prominent state senator who is working carefully with Senator Roland Gutierrez's office about helping those children. Specifically, those children, of course, cannot enter that building again. That building's got to be destroyed or perhaps the ground hallowed by some kind of memorial indeed, but the children cannot re-enter that building. There's got to be a new school constructed for them, and there are persons throughout the state who are working on that. And thanks be to God, there's lots of nonprofit, lots of ministers, lots of ministries and other helping agencies that are down in Uvalde. I'm getting reports, you're getting reports, but there still needs to be a focused effort to really leverage all of those resources on behalf of these families.
Well, I really appreciate you starting off with that pastoral word today. Speaking of public school kids, The last couple of sessions, it's felt like we've had some kumbaya moments with public school funding, and seemed like things were going in the right direction. But more and more over the course of the last few weeks, we've heard state elected officials, state leaders talking about the possibility of diverting public school dollars to private schools. And you've certainly had strong words in regards to Governor Abbott's rhetoric on that. So talk to our listeners about what's happening there and why Texans of faith should make this a priority.
Sure. Well, when COVID came along 2.5 years ago, the powerful and rich political forces determined that they would launch a chaos campaign, and that's what's happened. It's happened nationally, it's happened statewide, and the purpose and the goal is simply to sow discord and division. We see that there is no positive, proactive, constructive objective to this. And so they've succeeded. They've succeeded through the CRT campaign, that is critical race theory. Nobody had heard of it before a couple of years ago. Some think tank out of Washington designed a chaos program. Go take this trumped up, made up campaign to the local districts. That's what they did. And now we have a big fat mess. And then the pornography thing is just so ridiculous, Scott. I mean, right. Governor Abbott and his team have been in charge for a long time. If we've got pornography in the schools, they're responsible. It's not the teacher's responsibility. Of course, we know that's not true. We have God-fearing, very conservative local leaders all over the state that tell us that that's total baloney. And so, but the governor and his particular cadre is seeking now to take advantage of this situation by diverting public dollars, already strapped public dollars for our public schools, to private entities and private interests. It's called vouchers. It's a diversion of that money to specific individual families to pay for their private school education. Yes, this is the first time in our state's history that a governor has formally endorsed it. Now, we've had governors working behind the scenes. We've got Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, who's been pushing it for a long time. Texans don't want it. It has been repudiated. A voucher plan has been repudiated and rebuffed by, thanks to people like Texas Impact and the Christian Life Commission and Pastors for Texas Children and lots of other teacher groups, lots of other administrator groups. Such a policy has failed. I think we're sitting pretty positively to defeat it again. But here's the difference. It's going to be all hands on deck. It's going to require all of us being loud, being confrontational, drawing the line deeply in the sand, not just Colonel Travis's little thin sword, but I mean, we're going to have to get the shovel out and draw that line so that the 150 House members, the 31 Senate members, Dan Patrick twists a lot of arms. He's a manipulator in the Senate. Such a plan will probably pass the Senate. It'll have to be blocked in the House, and we'll have to maintain this wonderful Republican Democratic coalition, pro-public education coalition to block. We're told that Speaker Phelan has no appetite for a voucher plan to come before his body. It's just our job to make sure that happens, that is not a priority.
Well, in the last couple of sessions, there were more than 100 members of the Texas House out of 150 who opposed efforts to divert public school money, right? So how confident are we that will hold?
I think we're confident. We've had a good primary season. By our count, we were helping to we don't endorse candidates, but we endorse public education. And we were engaged in 20 races in the primary. 17 of those pro-public education House members have been reelected, most of them Republican, most of them rural leaders who believe in their public schools. They don't have any charter schools and private schools in their isolated, remote rural communities. And so they stand strong, joining the urban Democrats although we have some Democrats who are very, very soft on public education. We work with them, educate them, and confront them just as much as the Republicans. But No, you're right, Scott. I'm glad you mentioned it. It's something called the Arrero Amendment. Abel Arrero is a South Texas House member. Several sessions ago, he made an amendment prohibiting any public funds to go to private interests, basically. It's the first amendment that is proposed for the biannual or biennial, I think I should have said, budget every 2 years. And it passed overwhelmingly. There were only 21 House members that voted against the Arrero Amendment prohibiting public funds for private schools. We think that same number will hold. The governor will try to pressure those House members, but we asked them directly, looking them in the eye. Representative, we're going to support, we're going to support you here. But when the governor calls you saying that he needs your vote on a voucher bill, what are you going to tell him? Every one of them said, we're going to tell him, no, governor, can't help you there. So I think we're looking good. I do think, I want to say in the same breath, your insightful question, I think it's going to take all of us to roll up our sleeves and work extra hard, starting right now, and make this a noisy issue for our general election season starting right now, and confronting the governor with it. Look, Greg Abbott has now voluntarily attached his name to a voucher bill. Let's let him own it, right? Let's pin that to his chest, and let's confront him, and let's see if he really means business, or if he's just throwing a piece of red meat to his right-wing base.
I think it'll be an issue in a lot of these general election races, but I think it's also important for rural congregations, rural people of faith to be having conversations with their representatives in those rural areas, because like you mentioned, there are a lot of rural Republicans who have supported public schools, and it's important, in part because we've talked about this in the past on this program, that in these rural communities, says a guy who lives in one, the school is at the center of the community. The churches are involved and everybody's involved in supporting local schools, and so it's really important to have those conversations.
No, Scott, you are really identifying a very important cultural issue and policy issue in Texas. Texans love their public schools, and those public school principals and teachers and superintendents, they sit on the pews with us in our disciples churches and Methodist churches and Baptist churches and churches of Christ and non-denominational churches, Pentecostal churches. The school is the chief employer in the community, in urban neighborhoods represented generally, I'm generalizing, but generally by the Democrat, and rural communities represented generally by the Republican. And so we have this beautiful unifying dynamic, don't we? What a lovely thing. Truly a lovely thing right now that honors God and honors the vision of God, that we have a bipartisan, positive bipartisan consensus on public education. So I think we just need to remind Greg Abbott of that, remind Dan Patrick of that, and be as loud and proud as we can about our public schools.
Reverend Johnson, you would be happy to know that on Sunday, our pastor talked about public school teachers and the impact the last couple of years have had on them, and talked to us about thinking through everything that public school teachers have gone through. And you talked to a lot of public school teachers. We all know public school teachers. It's been a long couple of years, and now we have candidates for office, state leaders who are waging war on public education. Are you worried about the impact that's going to have on our teachers and school staff?
Yes, I am. I am not in despair, but I am concerned. Education is compelling, and it's positive, it's proactive, it's inspiring, it's motivational. And I think that moral power of helping a child name God's world, as the second chapter of Genesis describes and tells in that immortal story when God brought all the animals to the human to see what the human would name them. I think that's going to win the day. I think it's going to defeat all this noise, all this contrived chaos, as we call it. It's a chaos project. I use that term again. it's really beneath our contempt for a public official elected with the trust of the community to just propagate all those lies, but they've done it. And they continue to do it, and they do it even after it's exposed and even after they're confronted. No, Scott, I think that education's so compelling. I think young adults and young leaders are going to continue to be called to it. We are going to have another year or two of some real stress in this space. There is going to be a shortage of qualified teachers. And you mentioned your pastor. God love him or her, because may their tribe increase. We need to be preaching this from the pulpit, that God's claim and call on your life, young leader, is to come into the community public school and teach our children. Teachers need to be paid more. The classroom needs to be resourced more. We need to get rid of the standardized test, which is basically a vehicle for privatization. We need to quit flirting with these voucher policies and unlimited charter school policies. And we need to double down on great public schools that teach all 5.5 million Texas school children how to identify the mystery and the beauty of God's creation, so that they can be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it, as is the first commandment of God. Now, I am going to start preaching, aren't I, Scott? I better just bring it to a close right there. Now, I think we're going to get through it. It's going to be a tough season, but we're going to get through it, and we've just got to stay true to God's vision and true to each other.
I'll always take a second sermon on public education a week, so I appreciate that. I am, there are a lot of issues going on in the world right now. Every day we turn on the news and there's another issue that gets our attention. I wonder if you have some advice for listeners about how we can keep the focus on public schools, how we can keep focus on kids in our community. How can Texans of Faith make sure that one of the major issues we're talking about this election season is public education, as opposed to all of the other things that are causing noise?
Yeah, man, thank you. That's a powerful question. And, I'm sitting here in a wonderful United Methodist Church in North Dallas doing this interview with you. I have some Dallas meetings today, and I have a meeting with the pastor and some of her lay leaders this afternoon. There isn't any more important thing than we can do. Okay, 3 or 4 things come to mind. You've already mentioned. Pastor, preach this from your pulpit. Second, get a team, a task force. The church is called upon to do a lot of good things in the world. We understand that. And supporting public schools is only one of them. But get a task force to come under the authority of the local school principal and ask that leader, how can we help? And what she's going to say is, well, our kids are poor. They need school supplies. Take up those school supplies. Do it more than one time a year. Have a school supply closet that is very visible in the congregational life, where, people like Jana and me, whose kids are grown, can say, I meant to go to the store and buy that $100 worth of school supplies. I'm going to do that, bring it next Sunday. Scott, teacher appreciation is a powerful expression. Hold an event. Bring together the mayor, the city council, not just the school board. They go to events like that all the time. Bring together the county commissioner, the chamber of commerce, get all the leaders in the community together and celebrate those public school teachers. Pray for them, have an invocation, have a pastoral prayer, have a benediction, bring together all the wonderful, powerful faith traditions, Christian and Jewish and Muslim, and all the denominational traditions, and lift these teachers up to the Lord in prayer, and let the mayor and everybody else see you do that. And then third, it's a little more, they're increasing levels of involvement, but about 65% of our kids are on free and reduced lunch. That means they need some nutritious meals on weekends. Be a part of that backpack program, the backpack ministry. Let your church launch that, always under the authority and leadership of the school official. Church officials need to model this submission to the school officials. One-on-one mentoring and reading programs, man, there's not an engagement any more important than that. When you teach a child to read on grade level by third grade, statistics show that child is going to be successful in life. All kinds of ways that the local congregation can be a resource center for the local school. We have about 1,000 churches in our network, and I don't want to brag too much about that. We've just scratched the surface. Those pastors are committed. Those churches are dedicated and committed. But my goodness, we've probably got 50,000 churches in Texas. So every church ought to be involved in all 8,500 public schools.
And after they do all of that work, I know you'll want them to have conversations with their elected officials, and we are.
So that's the next step.
So
that's the
yeah.
Next step.
So where do we go?
I like it.
Give our listeners some homework, right? We're charging them to meet this summer.
I like it, and this is why we love Texas Impact, because y'all aren't Gnostic. You know that it's good to give a cup of cold water, but we also have to ask the question: where's the well for this whole community? And do we need to dig a new well? And do the public resources need to be allocated for that water system that provides everybody clean water? Okay, right. After you do that, what we call school ministry, or what the educational community might call school assistance, pick up the phone, call your house member in particular. Church, get a half a dozen people to do that. I'm going to give you a wonderful, dirty little secret that they don't like for us to say. When a House member, a state representative gets 6 or 8 phone calls, it directly impacts his or her vote, directly. That will change their mind. Second, better yet, to arrange a face-to-face visit. Do that in your community. That is their job. We're in church with them, on the softball field with them, in the grocery store with them. Pastor, they will take your meeting. Go get another couple of pastors from the community to go with you. Get a couple of deacons from the Baptist church, elders in the Church of Christ, the other leaders in the United Methodist Church, and about a half a dozen of y'all. Go and sit down with your state representative, get to know him, build a relationship with her. It will make a big difference. He will give you his cell phone number because he knows that you're a leader in the community. Look, here's something that you got to know. House members are always running, always running. They're elected every 2 years. There is no such thing as an off season electorally. It is a constant campaign. They know that you stand before 100 or 200 or 300 people 52 week. Well, more than that, because you're standing before them several times a week, but 52 Sundays out of the year, you are going to have their respect. You're going to get their attention. An email, a handwritten note has an incredible effect. I've just noticed this Methodist church has some literature on a table where they can write handwritten notes to the governor and to the attorney general. Praise be to God. Every church needs to be doing that. Let your elected officials know that you believe in public schools. The Senate side's a little tougher, Scott. So we only have 31 of those representing all the people in the state of Texas. They're elected every 4 years, so they're a little bit. Good ones are connected to the community, but they fly a little bit higher. That's okay. They will take your meeting. Pastor, you're important. You are called of God, and you are called by that congregation. And that Senate member and that House member will accord you the respect that you deserve. Furthermore, you don't have to brace them. You don't have to be inappropriate in any way. You certainly do this with gratitude for their service and respect for their position also. But when you take the extra step of contacting that policymaker, it has an effect that is exponential. You will change their mind on a public school vote. Tell them 2 or 3 things and tell them over and over and over. We want our schools fully funded. fully funded, and we're a long way behind in full funding of our public schools, and we do not want our public dollars that are subject to public transparency and public accountability and public honesty being diverted to private entities and private schools that have no accountability to the taxpayer. That's just simple biblical stewardship. And if you do that, you will be salt and light, as your leader told you to be.
Amen. Hey, Pastor, you might think of getting into this whole preaching thing. I feel like.
Well, you've hit me on my favorite subject, Scott, and I'm delighted to just express these convictions. Yeah, but here's the deal. You know it through Texas Impact. These pastors are committed.
Right.
My goodness. I'm one of tens of thousands. And they are dedicated professionals in their community. It's a little bit outside their wheelhouse. Y'all know this, to get them to take this extra step
right.
of making these phone calls, writing these emails. You want to bring them to the Capitol with Texas Impact. We want to bring them to the Capitol with Pastors for Texas Children. Y'all have a little bit tougher job because y'all are dealing with some of these other very, very essential and important, significant issues also. We're going to try to bring 3 pastors a day, at least on Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, 3 a day to the Capitol, not for any specific reason, simply to witness, to pray, to make these visits, not particularly to testify against a bad bill or for a good bill, just to be present in the Capitol. That's going to be a stretch for us. Yeah. It's hard for that pastor to drive that 2, 3, 4, 5 hours to the Capitol, spend a whole day, some cases 2 days. But Pastor, your witness is, if there's one thing Scott and I would try to convince you of, please believe us when we testify that your influence, your witness, your words have incredible impact on the Texas state legislature.
Amen. Those in-person visits to the Capitol are important, and we'll certainly look forward to seeing you there. Charlie, where can folks find you for more information? Any shameless plugs you want to leave us with?
www.pastorsfortexaschildren.com. Go to our website. Lots of information there. Thank you. We're on social media, Pastors for Texas Children. Like us on Facebook, Pastors for Texas Children. On Twitter, I'm not sure I recommend Twitter, but because it's ugly. It is. You got to stay prayed up before you get on Twitter. It's the political platform, but we're Pastors #4 TX Kids. Pastors #4 TX Kids. Pray for us. We're in 8 states now: Oklahoma, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and North Carolina. And we've planted seeds in a number of other states. It's just the concept of faith-based public school advocacy. And thank you for having me on your program.
Absolutely. Reverend Charles Johnson, Pastor for Texas Children. Really appreciate the time today. More appreciate the work you're doing every day on behalf of Texas kids. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us today for the weekly watch list is Joshua Houston. Josh, good to have you back.
Yeah, good to see you, Scott.
It's summer. I feel like I don't get to chat with you as much. We're all running and doing different things. Policy aside, how's life?
Busy. When you're married to a minister, summer gets really busy for her. So, yeah.
I feel you there. We'll be doing our own trips very soon. So jumping in, I know the entire world is watching the Supreme Court over the course of the next few weeks. We have a lot of decisions coming up, but there's one in particular that you're watching today.
Yeah, the Supreme Court is totally destroying the Establishment Clause to the Constitution, and that is the clause that gives the separation of church and state that people of faith have advocated for since the nation's founding. The U.S. Supreme Court in the last 5 years continues to take us down a really concerning road, making you pay through your tax dollars for other religions to teach their very sectarian doctrines. So they just ruled in a case called Carson versus Makin. It's a case out of Maine where Maine had a voucher program. And Maine said no money can be, state money can be used to teach religious doctrine. It's not an unusual clause or stipulation. Many states have these. So what the Supreme Court has just overturned is Maine's statute, anti-establishment statute, requiring that separation of funds. So I want to talk about how we got here in order to evidence just how far the Supreme Court is sliding and rewriting our traditional notions of religious freedom. A majority of the court now hold a judicial philosophy known as originalism. And originalists argued that the Constitution means what it meant in 1787 when it was written. But like biblical literalists that we know so well in the faith community, they have a very selective reading of history. So here's the history that the Supreme Court and the so-called originalists are just completely ignoring. So in 1787, and really before that, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were working to disestablish the church-state relationship in Virginia. After the Revolutionary War, Patrick Henry was governor of Virginia, and Patrick Henry wanted the General Assembly to pass legislation that would have funded religion and religious churches in Virginia in order to have those churches instill morals for the boys coming home from war and the horrors they had seen in war. And that ignited a big debate in Virginia. At that time, the Episcopal Church was the established church of Virginia. But Patrick Henry needed the votes, and the Episcopalians were not a majority. So debate ensued about how to include some faiths, but exclude others in a sort of what's called a multiple establishment system where there's more than one church that was the official church. The problem is it was a complete fool's errand. They could not decide on what doctrines were in and what doctrines were out. Meanwhile, Madison and Jefferson were continuing to argue that it was a fool's errand and mobilized people of faith to oppose Patrick Henry's legislation. They killed it, and they did more than that. They eventually wrote into the state constitution that no government funds could be used to go to religion. And that was called the Bill for Religious Freedom, was then the model for what would become the Establishment Clause in the U.S. Constitution. Fast forward throughout the 19th century, we continued to disestablish church and state as we created public school systems. Those public school systems then replaced the previous private school system where there were publicly funded private schools run by parochial systems. We did away with that. And that's the model that many of these voucher programs want to go back to, is they want to relitigate the 19th century. If you fast forward to 1947, when the Supreme Court first extended the Establishment Clause onto the states, a supermajority of states had a provision in their state constitutions that prohibited public funds from going to religious institutions. Texas is one of those states. It's Article 1, Section 7. So when the Supreme Court in 1947, in a case called Everson versus Board of Education, said, quote, "No tax in any amount, large or small, can be levied to support any religious activities or institutions," end quote. This was not a radical departure from what a majority of states had decided long ago. And that doctrine has held throughout the 20th century too. So fast forward to 2017, the court took a court case called Trinity Lutheran. And in this, a state, Missouri, created a program to refurbish old playgrounds at nonprofits and to make them safe for kids. But the state had one of these constitutional provisions that said no money can go to religious houses of worship. The church wanted to participate and ran into this problem with the state constitution of Missouri that said no aid to religion and was excluded, so they went to court. The Supreme Court overturned the state's constitutional provision and said that the state was discriminating against religion. And that's the key quote, discriminating against religion. That's the new doctrine that the Supreme Court is pushing. And at this point in 2017, the writing was on the wall. So then in 2020, just 3 years ago, I guess 2 years ago, in a case called Espinoza versus Montana, the state of Montana enacted a voucher program, but did not let religious schools participate because the state had a constitutional amendment prohibiting any public dollars going to religious institutions. The Supreme Court then said this was discrimination against religion too, and struck down the state's anti-establishment constitutional amendment. And this case is pretty critical because Texas also has a very similar constitutional provision to the one Montana had. Now I want to come to talk about Carson and why it's such a radical departure. In this case, the Supreme Court went a step even further. It's one thing to let religion participate in a program, but you can still kind of regulate how they're using that money, right? It's quite another thing to say that a state cannot prohibit or regulate the religious entity from teaching religious doctrine with taxpayer dollars. And the Supreme Court just said that restricting the use of taxpayer dollars to schools that actively teach religious doctrine discriminates against those schools. The Supreme Court found no merit in the argument that this was actually discriminatory against LGBTQ persons or persons of other religions, because those schools that are receiving the taxpayer funds actively exclude based on religious doctrine. So the Supreme Court literally said that the state can take Jewish tax dollars and give them to evangelical schools that will refuse to admit Jewish students, and then use those Jewish tax dollars to promote an evangelical version of Christianity. That is now constitutional according to the U.S. Supreme Court. And if this applies to schools, it certainly applies to all faith-based initiatives, such as adoption or foster care or disaster relief. It's only a matter of time before we have the issue of refusing to adopt LGBTQ parents winds up at the Supreme Court. This has been an active area of both legislation and executive rulemaking over the past 5 years. And it's only a matter of time before you have a court case where something like, I don't want to name names, but big evangelical disaster relief ministries start using state taxpayer dollars to evangelize and say things such as, accept Jesus or don't get the food. So the Supreme Court's taken us down a very divisive and theocratic road while ignoring 250 years of American history.
The thing I love about you, Josh Houston, is you can switch pretty quickly from one hat to another. So your law school hat did very well there. Thanks for that overview. I'm going to see if you can put your seminary hat on for just a second.
All right.
Why should people of faith care? What's your argument with your seminary hat on?
With my seminary hat on is that we in this nation have always been able to largely avoid, we've had flare-ups, but we've always been able to largely avoid big, massive strife between religions. We've always been able to coexist. I mean, there are exceptions. There's some anti-Catholicism in the Know-Nothing era before the Civil War, and some anti-Lutheran sentiments because of World War I and the Germans. Some anti-Muslim sentiment we've experienced in the past decade.
Yeah, I was going to say firsthand, yes.
Firsthand, yeah. You and I were the buffer between 12-year-old schoolgirls just at their Capitol for a Capitol Day and a field trip, and 15 bigots yelling horrible things at them with AR-15s over their shoulders, and flags that we then later saw at the insurrection on January 6th. But anyway, I digress to say we've certainly had problems. But when you think about human history and the Crusades or the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics in Europe, we have avoided that. And frankly, as an interfaith organization, most of our members don't enjoy conflict. Our whole kind of reason for existence is that we can work out our differences and work together. Despite our differences, we can agree on a number of things. Yeah. So now we're in an awkward position where we have to say, wait a minute, you're taking the tax dollars of our members and giving it to other faiths that are actively discriminating against our very members.
Right.
Whether they be Jewish or Unitarian or even just an open and affirming Protestant. They are going to be taking your tax dollars and giving it to schools that actively are teaching the opposite of what you believe.
Yeah.
And throughout American history, we've said that religion should be voluntary, including the funding of it. The very old phrase from 200 years ago is voluntarism, where all religion should not be supported by the state at all and should be completely voluntary. And if you cannot raise your own funds, then maybe you don't need to exist as a religion. It's a complete free market for religious ideas. And the Supreme Court is now allowing government to come in and I mean, this is further advancing a Christian nationalist agenda.
Yeah. So with yet another hat on, coming back to the Texas legislature and your work there, Charlie earlier in this episode talked about vouchers and the history of that in the state of Texas, and how there's been this great support for public education and opposing efforts to divert public school dollars to private schools. Does this change anything? Do you think that wall in the House continues to hold, or do we need to make sure that we're reinforcing that?
I mean, I think we have an important voice. The religious community has an important voice in opposing school vouchers, and we now have even more. I mean, it's not just speculation that they're going to be using this money to teach other faiths. We know they will be. They have a constitutional right to now with this case in our hands. And so, yeah, with my lobbyist hat on, we have to double down and recommit to preventing any sort of voucher program, because as soon as you do, as soon as you let the camel's nose under the tent, all that public money can be channeled to schools that teach religious ideas that you don't actively believe with your money.
Yeah, and we talked with Charlie about it being especially important to talk to rural Republicans. I have trouble saying that word, rural. But having conversations with them, because those communities do rely on public schools and see it as an important institution in their communities. I assume you echo that same viewpoint.
Yeah, 100%, Scott. It's super important to talk to rural Republicans about vouchers. That is where that's where the firewall's been. It's been a battle between, and this is one of those interesting things that's not 100% partisan issue. In this time of super politicized, just everything's politicized, including movies.
100 plus. It's like 100 plus in the House last time, right?
Yeah, and I don't want you to neglect Democrats either, because if you're in South Texas, and not just South Texas. I mean, there's certain Democrats in inner city areas too who have given up on the idea that the white majority will ever treat them equally. So there are not many, but there are a number of Democrats who need the pressure because either they're in various geographic regions that have some sort of interest, and they're going to get cross pressure too. It's important to pay attention to certain Democrats and Republicans equally. And rural Republicans historically have been able. It's been rural Republicans with a vast majority of Democrats who get you to 100 votes in the House, and that is more than enough to kill it. But there's going to be immense pressure coming from state leadership, including the governor, who's now weighed in for the first time in favor of a voucher system. So there will be enormous pressure on those rural Republicans, but those rural Republicans are voting in their district. I mean, in rural communities, the school is still the community center, and they know that what this is going to be is a giant entitlement program that will not benefit their communities. It will be suburban parents taking money from rural districts to send their kids to private schools, and in no way will it benefit the rural public school system.
So as we start to close out today, we have been giving our listeners homework assignment during this public education series to go meet with their state representatives, to go meet with their state senators, to meet with candidates for office, and talk to them about public education. I assume on this topic today, given what you've talked about, it's important that they represent themselves as people of faith when they go into those meetings, so they know who they're talking to. Assuming you believe that to be true, what do you hope they're saying to their candidates for office and elected representatives right now?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the fact that you are a different faith voice saying, hey, look, this is not a faith thing. I mean, this is certain faiths may feel this way, but the vast majority of the faith community is not on board with this. I think that's an important message. I think it's also important to say, like, these times we're in are very divisive. And the way it gets more divisive is people retreating into their tribal enclaves. And the way it gets less divisive is support for the community. And the community is often the public school. And the more we can have those shared ideas of community, the more important it is to our democracy. And the more we retreat into enclaves of ethnic, tribes, the more divisive times we're going to be in for. I mean, let's just remember the very first voucher bill in Texas was proposed in 1956. And that was right after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And that is not a coincidence.
Josh, I feel like I'm poking you with this last question. But is it too early to start thinking about voting in November?
It's never too early to start. You've got to start finding friends that think like-minded and making sure they get to the polls. Because Scott, I have just heard so many people, and they don't say it quite this way, right? But the essential question they're asking is, Josh, why do I keep going? Why not I just give up? And the answer is because you have the tools. Like, you're not powerless. These times we're in are hard. Change is slow. And let's remember, we didn't get here overnight. I mean, I went through a very long history of how we got here, and it's even longer, and we could have gone into more detail. You have the power in your hands to stop what's going on, and it won't happen in one election cycle, but it does happen through the election cycles. You have to be committed to democracy and showing up. And if you are doing that work already, good. Time to go to step 2, which is to find others and to do the work of community. Because there is wisdom in the community, but only if you do the work of community, and that's being engaged civically with various organizations, whatever it is, through your PTA. Maybe you start your own Moms for Equity group. I know we talked about that a couple episodes ago, about how a lot of the more divisive, extreme candidates were defeated by having mom groups that were just protecting their kids. It's about doing the work of community and getting back out there and joining things, joining your PTA, if it's school related, joining your local Rotary Club, whatever it is, getting back into community with one another, and helping others to get mobilized to do their civic duty to vote. We get out of this through voting. And it's really the only way out, because the other two options are bleak. It's, tyranny or revolution if you don't do your work at the ballot box.
All right, friends, we have work to do. Josh Houston, thanks for the time. Thanks for the history lesson. Thanks for the inspirational word. It's always good seeing you, my friend. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, it's good to see you, Scott.
I want to thank our guests today, Reverend Erin Walter, Reverend Charles Johnson, and Josh Houston. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. The kids are out of school, but our homework continues to make sure Texas public schools are strong for Texas kids. There will be those that try to use religion as a reason to divert public dollars from public schools, so it's especially important that people of faith who support public schools have conversations with our representatives and candidates for office. And the summer is a perfect time to get organized and start to have those conversations. So let's all take a step in that direction this week. We hope to equip you to do that. If you have questions or suggestions for the podcast, please reach out to me at scott@texasimpact.org. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content, so hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And y'all, there is a lot going on, so keep an eye on Texas Impact social media. We'll have announcements soon about Texas Impact's legislative agenda and upcoming announcements about our Faith and Democracy series, so make sure you're subscribed and following all of the Texas Impact channels. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Y'all, there is a lot of noise out there, but your priorities are important. So let's get to work making sure that people are paying attention to you. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnan, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.